After returning from a week-long international trip, I was pleasantly surprised to hear a call from my mother-in-law Linda. Her voice sounded unusually animated, almost triumphant, and before I could ask what caused her joy, she threw into the conversation, as if casually, "You have no idea what luck we all caught. We have savings of $30,000. These words made me stop. For a second I thought it was just a misunderstanding, but then her joyful intonation turned into a stream of thanks. Linda mentioned that the money was somehow connected to my accounts, and I, according to her, seemed to give her this chance. Incredulously, I tried to remember where such a sum could have come from. As a jewelry designer, I earn quite well, but I invest every penny back into the business. There was no such money in my personal savings account. It was intended solely for unforeseen expenses, and I always carefully control my finances. Trying to make sense of her words, I interrupted her by asking a question that was literally boiling on the tip of my tongue. "Linda, what are you talking about?" She quickly replied that she had found my account, in her words, in the buffet, and took it for convenience. Her tone sounded like it was something that was taken for granted. "You and Patrick are living so well that I thought everything was fine. Isn't that right?" she concluded, leaving no room for objections. This call left me completely at a loss. Her words came out of the blue. Up to this point, I had never thought about restricting access to finances, especially for my family, but the situation made me doubt my own carelessness. When Patrick returned home, I immediately shared this story with him. He listened to me with a stony expression on his face, and then, sighing, explained that it was a misunderstanding. It turns out that Linda misunderstood the documents that happened to be in her hands, and considered them confirmation that we have $30,000 available. Although the situation was resolved, the sediment remained. A month later, Linda's calls began to haunt me again. This time there were so many of them that my phone screen showed more than 60 missed calls. I tried to ignore them, hoping that she would realize that she was overreacting, but eventually she answered. Her voice, shrill and full of resentment, literally blew up the silence of the room. Linda accused me of ignoring her, as if I were deliberately avoiding communication. There was not just disappointment in her tone, but a kind of deep confidence in her rightness, as if she was deprived of something. I, a 35-year-old jewelry designer, a woman who builds a career on her efforts and strives for harmony in the family, found myself in the middle of a conflict that had nothing to do with. My marriage with Patrick has undergone major changes in recent years. I started with rare orders, depended on his stable work in the corporate sphere, but over time my projects gained momentum, and now I run a thriving business. Patrick, despite his successful career, decided to join me, applying his managerial skills to our joint business. This decision turned out to be fateful for both of us, but it also brought its own difficulties. Money-related problems have become an integral part of our lives, especially when it comes to family. Linda, who had previously supported us verbally, now saw our success as just a reason to wait. My patience began to crack at the seams, and I realized that I would have to find a way to set boundaries. As soon as Linda finished her emotional tirade, keeping an outward calm, replied that I would call her back later. Putting the phone down on the table, I froze for a moment, feeling anger and confusion rolling in waves. This was not the first situation in which her intervention turned our lives upside down. But for the first time, I felt that all this could turn into something more than just a misunderstanding. Patrick entered the room, holding a cup of coffee in his hands. His gaze immediately settled on my tense face. He sat down next to me, put the cup on the table and, taking my hand, asked, "Has Linda called again?" 60 times, Patrick, 60, I replied with noticeable bitterness. And all because she feels entitled to accuse me of ignoring. Although, in fact, she creates problems out of thin air. He lowered his head, rubbed his temples, as if he was going to say something important, but fell silent. I knew that look in his eyes. He always tried to smooth out the rough edges, especially when it came to his mother. Patrick, it's not a small thing anymore. She thinks we owe it to her. And this belief of hers is growing every day. He was silent for a long time, and then he said softly, "You're right. I need to talk to her. But it will be difficult." "Is it difficult?" I asked, barely able to contain my irritation. "Is it difficult for you to explain to your mother that we have our own boundaries, our own obligations?" "It's not that easy," he replied, and there was a note of weariness in his voice. "She raised me alone. It was hard for her. I can't just turn her down, you know?" This conversation was like a mirror of our marriage. We were both used to discussing problems, but when it came to family, our approaches were very different. I grew up in a family where boundaries were respected and help was not considered a duty. It was different for Patrick. Linda was not just his mother, she was his anchor, and he felt indebted to her in almost everything. I got up to pour myself a glass of water and tried to calm down. Thoughts were spinning in my head about how to explain to Linda that her expectations were beyond reasonable. But how to do this without destroying her relationship with her son? "You know, Patrick," I finally said, turning to him. "I understand why you want to help her. But if this continues, it will destroy not only our business, but also us." He looked up, and I saw a mixture of guilt and understanding in his eyes. "All right," he said, getting up. "I'll talk to her. But let's do it together. You're important to her too, and maybe she'll listen if she hears both of us." This suggestion took me by surprise. In the past, he always tried to sort things out on his own so that I wouldn't interfere. Maybe he finally realized that we are partners not only in business, but also in life. But somewhere deep inside, I knew that this conversation would be a test for us. The next day, Patrick and I went to Linda's. The path to her house, usually calm and even pleasant, felt like a road to battle today. My thoughts whirled through my head, each new argument overlapping the previous one. I tried to find words that could express everything: respect, but also firmness, understanding, but also boundaries. Patrick, sitting at the wheel, was silent. His hands were gripping the steering wheel tightly, and his eyes were fixed on the road. I could feel his tension. He had repeatedly said how difficult it was for him to stand up to his mother, even when her actions went beyond reason. Linda's house, small and cozy, stood in a quiet suburb. When we entered, she was already waiting for us. Her smile was wide, but there was expectation in her eyes, perhaps even a challenge. "Oh, finally. I already thought you'd completely forgotten me," she said, hugging Patrick and, noticeably cooler, me. We went into the living room. Linda offered tea, but I declined, deciding it was better to get straight to the point. Patrick also sat on the edge of the sofa, clearly not intending to prolong the visit. "Mom," he began without looking up. "We need to talk." Her face changed, her smile faded, and she crossed her arms over her chest. "To talk? Something happened?" "Yes," I replied, taking the floor. "Linda, you called me several times, and I realized that we need to discuss the boundaries related to finances." Her eyebrows shot up and she leaned forward as if in disbelief. "Boundaries? What other boundaries? We're a family. How can there be such conversations in the family?" "Family is about mutual respect," I replied, trying to speak softly but confidently. "Patrick and I support you, and we will do it when it is really necessary. But we also have our obligations, which we cannot ignore." Linda sat up abruptly. "So now I'm a burden? Are you saying that I should stop hoping for help from you?" Patrick raised his hand at that moment, asking her to listen. "Mom, no one thinks you're a burden. But I want you to understand that our situation has changed. We work together, we build a business, we have plans and expenses. Sometimes your expectations don't match up with our reality." She stared at him as if he were speaking an unfamiliar language. So I raised you alone for nothing? Did you give everything in vain to make you grow up and become successful? Now that you have the money, have you decided that you don't need me anymore? Her voice was trembling, and I felt Patrick shrink. I need you, Mom, he replied softly. But I want our help to be reasonable and not harm either you or us. I saw how he struggled to find a balance between caring for her and protecting our interests. It wasn't easy, and I decided to support him. Linda, I said, trying to be as calm as possible, we appreciate everything you've done for Patrick. But now we want to build our future so that we have the resources not only to help you, but also not to find ourselves in a difficult situation. Her face paled, and for a moment I thought she might agree. But her next question caught me off guard. So you already have a plan on how to limit my help? Her voice sounded cold, almost icy, and I realized that the conversation had just begun. Managing success turned out to be a much more difficult task than we could have imagined, especially given the constant pressure from Linda. Her house, once a cozy family nest, now looked more and more like the center of gravity of endless demands. She saw our lifestyle as a symbol of unlimited opportunities, not seeing the work, busy schedules, and difficult negotiations behind it. She saw every appearance we made in public, whether it was business dinners or presentations, as a pleasant pastime. Dresses and jewelry, which I chose with care to emphasize my professionalism, were just objects of envy for her. How beautiful you are, darling. This chic life suits you, she said with a touch of sarcasm. Over time, her requests became more and more bold. The other day, she called Patrick to ask for money for a friend's birthday party. This is a small thing for you, isn't it? She said, without waiting for an explanation that our income is far from a bottomless well. Our expenses were indeed high, but they were dictated not by luxury, but by necessity. Working with international brands required us to adhere to a high level, which meant spending on image, business meetings, trips, and presentations. Linda, on the other hand, saw only the facade of this life, filled with glitter and chic, without understanding its real value. Patrick, in an attempt to keep the peace, often gave in to her requests, believing that it was cheaper than quarreling. A little money to stop her complaining is a small price to pay for peace of mind, he said. I understood his position, but each time Linda's concessions only strengthened her confidence that she had the right to demand more. Recently, her requests have reached a peak. She came to our house, saying that she needed a new dress for the upcoming event, and stressed that the old one wouldn't do. She added that a matching bag is needed with the dress, because, at a fashionable party, she can't be the only one who looks old-fashioned. This situation made us both angry, especially considering that we recently issued her a credit card, which was subject to certain restrictions. Patrick, anticipating possible difficulties, asked her to coordinate large purchases with us. However, Linda perceived the map as an unlimited resource. At first, she spent much more than we expected, buying an expensive, exquisite ring. When Patrick was faced with an exorbitantly high bill, he talked to his mother, asking her to be careful. To which she replied that she couldn't resist such beauty and regrets that she didn't warn us in advance. After that, we decided to limit the use of the card, but the situation still got out of control. Linda continued to make purchases without thinking about the fact that we were paying for each of them. Patrick, this is getting unbearable, I said, laying out the next bills. We either stop this, or we will find ourselves in a financial abyss. He seemed to share my concern, but he was still experiencing internal conflict. She doesn't understand how it works, he said. For her, the map is just a tool, not a responsibility. Then we need to explain it to her. And if she doesn't understand, she'll have to take the card back, I replied firmly. The conversation with Linda was going to be difficult, but the need to take control of the situation was becoming more and more obvious. We couldn't afford for her unlimited expectations to destroy what we had worked so hard to build. We decided not to postpone this conversation. The next bill that came in last week was the last straw. It showed an amount in excess of everything Linda had spent before, and in the purpose column it read, "Purchase of designer furniture for the living room." Her tastes were clearly becoming more sophisticated, and her spending was uncontrollable. This time, I insisted that we both explain to her what was going on. We arrived at her house in the late afternoon, knowing that it would not be easy. Linda greeted us with her usual smile, as if nothing had happened. She was happily talking about her plans to renovate the interior, not even suspecting that we were here for a completely different reason. "Mom, we need to talk," Patrick began as soon as we sat down in the living room. "Of course, dear, about what?" She clearly did not expect a serious tone. "About your expenses," he continued. Linda tensed, but the smile didn't disappear. "Are you saying I'm spending too much?" "But it's not for me, it's for the house. This is a family home." "This is our business, Linda," I interjected, trying to speak calmly but firmly. "We don't mind helping you, but you should understand that every amount spent is part of our budget. We have obligations that go beyond personal needs." Her face paled slightly, and she seemed to be searching for words to answer. "Do you want to pick up the card?" "What is it?" she asked reproachfully. "We want you to use it wisely," Patrick said, "and coordinated large expenses with us, as we asked." "But I'm doing this for the family," she exclaimed, jumping up from her seat. "Do you think I'm selfish? I just want some joy in my life. Is that too much?" Her voice was trembling, and I could feel her emotions boiling over. "Linda," I said, trying to soften the situation, "we understand that you want to live comfortably, but you have to understand us too. Our business requires huge investments, and every unauthorized purchase puts us in a difficult position." She sank back onto the couch and sighed. "I didn't know it was that serious," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "It seemed to me that everything was fine with you. You look so confident, so happy." "We're trying, Mom," Patrick said. "But it's not easy." "Okay, I'll try to be more careful," she finally said. But I didn't hear a promise in her voice, just a desire to end the conversation. We left with a sense of relief, but also anxiety. I knew that this was a temporary solution, and Linda was unlikely to change her habits so easily. Now we had to prepare for the next step, and for the possible consequences if she couldn't accept our boarders. Patrick, despite his tolerance and desire to keep the peace, still could not indefinitely remain a bystander. After a lot of conversations, showdowns, and unjustified expenses, he decided to set a strict limit on Linda's expenses on her card. This measure was more of a compromise than a final solution, but it was supposed to protect us from financial instability. Linda's reaction, as we expected, was violent. One day, late in the evening, she literally burst into our house. Her face was red with indignation, and her voice vibrated with indignation. "Why the hell can't I pay for my purchases?" she protested loudly, not bothering to greet him. Patrick, who had just completed an online meeting, glanced at me, and I realized that he was hoping that I would be able to defuse the situation. "Mom, let's talk calmly," he said, getting up from his chair. "We've already discussed this. You're spending more than we can afford." Linda threw her purse on the sofa and, with sparkling eyes, turned to him. "You two dress up, go to fancy restaurants, travel all over the world, and I can't even buy decent things? Why are you allowed, but I'm not?" I held back a sigh and tried to stay calm. "Linda, what you see is part of our job. Our meetings, presentations, and dinners are not entertainment. These are the commitments on which the success of our business depends." "A job? What is it?" she asked doubtfully. "How is what I do different? It's not fair that you live like this, and I have to limit myself." Her voice was full of resentment. Linda sincerely did not understand why her requests were perceived as a burden, while our business expenses seem to her to be excesses. We don't live in luxury, Patrick interjected. Our expenses are a necessity to maintain a reputation and attract customers. Linda snorted, but didn't object. Her enthusiasm clearly waned when Patrick stressed that the limit on the card was not a punishment, but a precautionary measure. For a while after that, the situation seemed stable. Linda complained from time to time, but not as violently as before. However, the calm turned out to be only the calm before the storm, when I received a tempting offer from one of our foreign partners. The company offered us to move part of the base abroad, providing access to new markets and the opportunity to strengthen our status. For me, as a designer, it was a chance to rise to a new level. Patrick saw this as an opportunity, too. His support has always been my mainstay, and now he assured me, "This is our chance, Mary. We have to use it." However, it was clear from the very beginning that the news would cause Linda a new wave of anxiety. And she really didn't keep me waiting. When we told her about the plans, her reaction was predictable, but no less exhausting. "So that's why you're doing all this?" she exclaimed, slapping the arms of her chair with her palms. "You want to leave me here, and you will live there like kings." "Mom," Patrick tried to explain, "this is not a vacation. It's a job. We're going to be very busy, and it's temporary." "Temporarily? What is it?" she asked, clearly not believing it. "And if you like it there? You'll just forget about me." Her words were both hurtful and exhausting. I understood that her fears were not unfounded, but they came from a wrong perception of our lives. "Linda," I said softly, "we plan to return as soon as our work is completed. This is not a permanent move." But she stubbornly refused to believe. "You say that, but I know you just want to get rid of me." Patrick rubbed his face with his hands, exhaling slowly, as if counting to 10 so as not to explode. "Okay," he said finally. "We can't take you with us. It's impossible. But how about we pay you for a week-long trip? You can come and see for yourself what we're doing." Her face lit up. "Are you serious? Will you pay for my flight and hotel?" "Yes, but you'll have to take care of the rest of the expenses," Patrick clarified. Linda thought for a moment, but then she smiled broadly. "That sounds fair," she said, standing up. "Okay, then I'll start planning." When she left, half happy, we both exhaled. However, I still had the feeling that this compromise had only temporarily postponed the inevitable. A few days later, when Patrick was completely immersed in arranging the move, Linda showed up at our house. I hadn't even finished my morning cup of coffee when her voice echoed through the room. "Hey, Mary, Patrick said you're going abroad, but I want to shop there too. Can you give me some money?" "What is it?" she asked, as if it were a simple household request, and not something out of the ordinary. I slowly put the cup down on the table, realizing that another argument was waiting for me. "What about the map Patrick gave you?" I asked, trying to keep my voice calm. Her face fell and she frowned slightly, clearly not expecting such a question. "Tell you what, Patrick took this card away from me the other day. He said I was spending too much." Her voice was full of resentment, and her tone was full of accusation. I sighed, realizing that Patrick had probably done the right thing, although now I would have to face the consequences. "I don't have that kind of money on hand either, Linda," I replied, keeping calm. "I can't give you money without Patrick's approval. Maybe you can talk to him?" Her eyes flashed. "It's useless to ask him, that's why I'm asking you," she insisted, raising her voice. Her desperation was noticeable, but I knew I couldn't give in. Another compromise would only make the situation worse. Linda, despite her irritation, still went on a trip. Patrick somehow managed to find a way to finance her trip, wanting to avoid another scandal. When she returned 10 days later, she called me, beaming with joy. "I'm back," Mary. It was so much fun. She started from the doorway. You should have seen, sightseeing, dinners, adventures. She started talking about the trip with such enthusiasm that I barely had time to follow her words. And I bought souvenirs, she added with a satisfied smile. They didn't fit in my suitcase, so I sent them here. It's nice, I replied, trying to sound neutral, although a slight unease was beginning to build inside. And then she dropped a phrase that made me tense up. Thanks to the money that you have accumulated, I was delighted. What kind of money? I asked, feeling everything freeze inside. Well, the ones I found in the cupboard drawer at your house. The world around me stopped existing for a moment. In the cupboard drawer? I repeated, trying to stay calm even though my heart was pounding in my chest. Linda, what kind of money are you talking about? About $30,000. I found them and thought you were putting them off. My confusion turned to shock. Did you take $30,000 from our house without asking? Her answer was frighteningly casual. Well, yes, I thought it was okay. You always live so luxuriously. Linda, I said, raising my voice but trying to control myself. It's not your money. To take them without permission is theft. You're exaggerating, Mary, she said. I'm telling you now, so it's kind of like a report. This is not a report, Linda. This is a violation of boundaries. Do you realize that this money could have been set aside for important transactions? She shrugged her shoulders as if it was unimportant. Well, you live so wastefully. Why can't I think of it as a favor? Her indifference and self-confidence left me speechless. I realized that this conversation is not just about money. It was about how much Linda disrespected our efforts, our work, and our boundaries. When Patrick returned home that evening, I immediately noticed that he was worried. His usually calm face reflected hidden anxiety. Mary, do you know about the money I left in the cupboard drawer? What is it? He asked as soon as he entered the room. My inner world froze. What kind of money are you talking about? I replied, trying to stay calm, although I already guessed where this conversation was going. 15 days ago, I withdrew $30,000 from my bank account. I needed cash for an urgent payment, he explained. And now they're gone. I tensed, trying not to show my excitement. Did you leave that amount at home? In the cupboard drawer? I asked in disbelief. It was careless, I know, he admitted, shaking his head. But I had to keep everything handy. Have you seen them? And at that moment, like a flash of lightning, everything fell into place. Linda. Her enthusiastic stories about the trip, mentioning the accumulated money. It was the same $30,000. Patrick, I think I know what happened, I began, feeling the muscles in my neck tighten. I told him about the conversation with Linda, her careless words about the money found. His face turned pale at first, then reddened. Did she take them? Without permission? His voice was shaking with anger. That's right, I said. She thought you wouldn't notice anything. Patrick sat down on the sofa, holding his head. This money, it was meant to pay off her debts. Do you remember me saying that she got into credit card debt? I nodded, remembering his story. When I lowered the limit on her card, she started borrowing money from other sources, he continued. Credit cards, consumer loans. She hid it from us. When I found out, I decided to withdraw money to pay off everything at once and bypass bank reports to avoid complications for our business. I was silent, stunned. It was also a farewell gesture, he added. We are going abroad, and I wanted to leave everything in order so that she would not face new problems. His explanation was logical, but I couldn't help but wonder how far Linda had gone in her actions. The situation seemed to be getting more complicated. Linda didn't seem to realize that her actions were undermining trust. She believed that she was entitled to any help, simply because she was a mother. A few days later, Linda called me, and her voice sounded like she was on edge. "Why aren't you answering my calls? I've called so many times." Her voice was trembling. "I'm sorry, Linda, I've been busy moving," I replied, trying to speak softly. "What happened?" "This is all too complicated," she almost whispered. "They demand payment every day. I can't take it anymore." "Have you tried to contact Patrick?" I asked, hoping she'd done it before calling me. "He seems to have blocked my calls," she admitted, and I could hear the desperation in her voice. "You're my only hope now, Mary. Please help me." I sighed, feeling the weight of her words. The situation was getting more complicated, and I realized that this time a simple conversation would not solve the problem. The financial chaos that Linda had driven herself into became a burden that could not be ignored, especially at the moment when we were preparing to move abroad and start a new stage in our lives. Every day brought new calls from creditors insistently demanding their money, and threatening letters about debt collection. It seemed that this storm had hit us at the most inopportune moment, mixing up all plans and filling our days with anxiety. I couldn't help but be surprised by Patrick's sharpness when he talked about his mother. Her debts, he said, were only the result of her irresponsibility. He believed that he gave her a chance to deal with this situation when he withdrew money to pay off debts, but she herself missed this chance, throwing everything to the wind for the sake of pleasure. The money was meant for her debts, he said when I told him about Linda's call. And instead she spent it on a trip. How can I trust her again? There was weariness and sadness in his voice, but also firmness. He wasn't ready to make concessions again, and although part of me wanted to convince him to help, I knew he was adamant about it. "She's your mother, Patrick," I said carefully. "Are you really ready to just leave her in this situation?" "She made her choice, Mary," he replied coldly. "We can't afford it anymore." It was a painful confession. Linda, despite all her mistakes, was Patrick's mother. But reality dictated its own rules. Our finances were at the limit due to the move and new obligations, and we could not afford to become her eternal support. I decided to follow Patrick's example and blocked her number, even though guilt plagued me. With each call, Linda sounded more and more like someone who was desperately trying to find help, but I knew that our support would only increase her dependence. But the hardest blow for us was the news of the sale of her house. I discovered this by accident while packing up for the move. In one of the boxes were documents that indicated a real estate deal. The family home where Patrick grew up now belongs to other people. When I told Patrick about this, his face became stern and distant. "Did you know about this?" I asked, feeling my own emotions rising in my throat. "No," he replied softly. "But I'm not surprised." "This was your house," I said, trying to catch his eye. "The house was lost a long time ago, Mary," he replied, clenching his hands into fists. "She just signed the last document." His voice was laced with bitterness, and I realized that for him this was not just a loss of property. It was the loss of the past, of a part of himself. "Do you really not care?" I asked, feeling that his words were hiding more than he was willing to admit. "Of course I care," he whispered, lowering his head. "But what can we do?" I knew he was right. The house was mortgaged against huge debts, and even its sale could not cover them completely. But the thought that the place where Patrick grew up would no longer be a part of his life hurt me. It reminded me of my own past, of the home I lost as a child, and of the emptiness that remained after that. We tried to focus on the future, on our new beginning, but the bittersweet feeling of loss still haunted us. The house that was once the center of the family has now become a part of the memories. And although we had to start a new life, this fact remained a shadow, reminding us that there are things in our lives that cannot be fixed. When moving day finally arrived, I watched Patrick say goodbye to our house. His gaze lingered on the front door a little longer than usual. He didn't say a word, but his silence said more than any words could express. Patrick silently felt the loss. The loss of the house, which was not just a building, but a symbol of stability and memories, was inexpressibly bitter for him. This place was his emotional refuge, where every crack in the wall, every creak of the floorboard reminded him of childhood, of the halcyon times before life became complicated. Now it was all gone, leaving behind a void that dragged along his memories and scraps of the past. Linda, in turn, was trying to adapt to the new reality. She moved into a modest apartment, completely different from her previous home. Comfort and spaciousness gave way to cramped rooms that seemed to squeeze her from all sides. Her life, once filled with carelessness and uncontrollable expenses, now consisted of strict restrictions. Part-time work helped to cover basic needs, but it was not satisfying. Linda faced problems that often come with age: fatigue, the inability to find a suitable job that would not be too physically exhausting, and the feeling that life is narrowing down to a limited range of opportunities. I had mixed feelings about her. On the one hand, I sympathized with her struggle. It was hard to see a man accustomed to financial freedom suddenly find himself in a world of austerity. But on the other hand, her current situation was a direct result of her actions, her inability to control her spending and listen to warnings. Life teaches us that actions have consequences, and Linda's case was a confirmation of this truth. Financial responsibility is a lesson that cannot be ignored, regardless of age. Meanwhile, our life in the new country was strikingly different from everything that had happened before. Moving abroad has given us a unique opportunity to bring our business to the international level. We were immersed in a new world, where every day brought a flurry of requests, offers of cooperation, and endless meetings. Our brand suddenly found itself in the spotlight. Emails and calls came from different parts of the world, each of which promised new horizons and incredible prospects. Patrick and I worked as a team, breathing new life into our business and striving to meet, if not exceed, the expectations of our partners. Each new offer had the potential to expand, and it was incredibly inspiring, but also extremely exhausting. We adapted to the demands of the new market, constantly searching for ideas and solutions to keep up the pace set by our new reality. Sometimes I found myself thinking that our life had become something like a marathon. We were moving forward all the time, but less and less often we looked back. The loss of Patrick's house and Linda's new life reminded us that any achievement has a price. At such moments, we found solace in the fact that we created our future with our own hands. Our successes were not an accident, and although the weight of the past still weighed on us, we knew that we were moving forward. Life taught us to adapt, and we tried to cope with its lessons, no matter how hard they were. Our days have turned into an endless whirlwind of negotiations, meetings, calls, and planning. Success inspires, but at the same time completely absorbs us, depriving us of the opportunity to stop and take a breath. Time zones change each other, like pages in a book that you read in a hurry, not noticing the details. We live as if in a fog, the line between day and night is blurred, time flows without pauses, capturing us in its ruthless rhythm. From the window of our apartment there is a breathtaking view of the city, immersed in neon lights that color the night sky in the colors of promises. This city is a symbol of our new stage, our new home. But beneath its brightness lies loneliness and anonymity, which stand in stark contrast to the quiet, familiar streets that we once called our haven. The complexity of our new life is both fascinating and frightening. Every morning starts with a new challenge. Every night ends not with answers, but with even more questions. We eagerly rush into this new world, but we pay a high price for it. The dream of expanding our family, which we have cherished for so long, seems like a distant vision. It recedes into the background, obscured by waves of immediate demand and schedules that cannot be broken. Sometimes, late at night, Patrick and I talk about it, sharing our hopes, but each time we return to reality, realizing that we simply cannot afford the step yet. Patrick, who has taken on a huge burden of responsibility, from logistics to customer management, feels the tension more acutely than ever. We are partners not only in business, but also in life, and this imposes additional pressure. We both ask ourselves questions: what is more important to us? How to find a balance between professional ambitions and personal desires. I often stand at the window, looking at the lights of the night city, and think about which path we have chosen. Linda, with her struggles and difficulties, still occupies a place in my thoughts. Her story reminds me of how closely intertwined our elections and their consequences are. She is a living illustration of how our actions shape not only our lives, but also the lives of those around us. Every decision we make in this new chapter is a sacrifice. Every success is a step forward, but with it comes the realization that somewhere, perhaps, we are losing something.